Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marianne Hamilton Lopez, Senior Research Director of Biomedical Innovation at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. On behalf of Duke Margolis, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is the final installment of our three-part series focused on novel antibiotics and antimicrobial resistance, often referred to as AMR. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge Nicholas Harrison and Cameron Joyce for their role organizing this webinar. And I'd also like to thank the AMR Action Fund for providing support for this endeavor. Today we'll focus on novel antibiotic development with emphasis on regulatory practices and related topics such as clinical trials. During our conversation, we'll hear from experts who will consider development and regulatory approaches to sustain antibiotic innovation. We'll highlight regulatory expectations and their impact on clinical trials for novel antibiotics, international regulatory harmonization and clinical trials beyond the United States, developmental partnerships towards novel antibiotics for unmet needs, and post-market evidence development and the potential impact of real-world evidence. The discussion will inform policy and approaches to advance clinical trials, evidence development, and regulatory practices to sustain the market for critically needed novel antibiotics. Next slide, please. We open today's webinar with a conversation with Dr. John Farley, Director of the Office of Infectious Diseases in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Farley joined the FDA in 2009 and was appointed Director of the Office of Infectious Diseases in June 2020. Dr. Farley presided over the office's response to COVID-19 and supports regulatory science to combat AMR. Welcome, Dr. Farley.
Thanks, Marianne. It's great to be here.
I'd like to start by asking about how the FDA supports the U.S. National Action Plan to combat antibiotic-resistant bacteria, particularly the development and approval of innovative antibiotics and efforts to advance the stewardship of antibiotics.
Sure. So one of the goals of the National Action Plan is to accelerate basic and applied research and development for new antibiotics, other therapeutics, and vaccines. And of course, this is an all-of-government approach with our colleagues at NIH and BARDA helping to support and de-risk development programs. Our work at CDER has mainly focused on working with sponsors and thought leaders to develop feasible designs for clinical trials that will lead to interpretable data. And I'd like to talk more about that as our conversation continues around regulatory approaches. With respect to stewardship, when I think of that in this space, I tend to think of it as appropriate use of the therapeutic tools that we have. And CDC and professional societies like the American Academy of Pediatrics have done impactful work reducing inappropriate antibiotic use in the outpatient space. In the inpatient space, I think it's a little different. The data that I've seen highlights an appropriate use issue, and that is ongoing use of older and less effective therapeutic options like polymyxins for difficult to treat gram-negative infections, while newer beta-lactamase inhibitor combinations with better effectiveness data, better safety profiles remain underused.
Thank you. You were mentioning the kind of existing FDA tools. How do existing regulatory incentives facilitate the development of novel antibiotics?
So with respect to incentives, the GAIN Act facilitated incentives and established those in this space, most notably a 5-year exclusivity extension for certain applications of drug products that have been designated as a qualified infectious disease product and meeting certain other requirements at the time of review. So this 5-year exclusivity extension is added to any exclusivity for which the application qualifies upon approval. And additionally, the statute requires FDA to give priority review to the first application submitted for approval of a qualified infectious disease product that meets the criteria necessary. And what we often call a QIDP in this space also receives fast track designation at the sponsor's request. Recently, biologic products to be submitted to the agency are also eligible to receive designation as a QIDP if they meet certain criteria and would benefit from those incentives at the end of the day as well. But I think while these incentives, as well as the development support offered by our HHS partners, is helpful, I think everyone on the call recognizes that the economic model for new antibiotics post-approval is the major challenge in this space.
Thank you. Can you tell us how the relatively new limited population pathway for antibacterial and antifungal drugs supports novel antibiotic development? And perhaps also within that
Sure.
context, how does that work with the kind of economic issues that you just laid out before?
Um, well, let's talk about the development because you've got to get to market, right? And that's certainly the goal. I think before I talk about the limited population antibacterial drug pathway, the LPAD pathway, I kind of want to talk about our regulatory approaches. And LPAD is actually the second one. There's a first one that kind of underpins LPAD and is broader. And both of those are focusing on addressing unmet medical need for the treatment of serious bacterial diseases. So the first is a flexible clinical development program, development approach rather, outlined in our guidance for industry, which is entitled Antibiotic Therapies for Patients with an Unmet Medical Need for the Treatment of Serious Bacterial Diseases. And we just published a Q&A revision in May of 2022 for this guidance. And the guidance is aligned with a long-standing FDA position that it's appropriate to exercise the broadest flexibility in applying the statutory standards while preserving appropriate guarantees for safety and effectiveness, as physicians and patients are generally willing to accept greater risks or side effects from products that treat life-threatening and severely debilitating illnesses than they would accept from products that treat less serious illnesses. So at the end of the day, for programs in this space that are seeking to use this flexible pathway, we do need a successful, adequate, and well-controlled trial, adequate safety information, but we're willing to accept smaller sample sizes and greater uncertainty than we usually would. And we've used some of the flexibility options described in this guidance to approve a number of important new anti-infective drugs, and including two in the past year. One is Rezio, which is an echinocandin antifungal for patients who have limited or no alternative options for the treatment of candidemia and invasive candidiasis. That has an advantage in terms of dosing frequency. And it was a single trial, a wider NI margin was accepted, non-inferiority margin. And it was really the first antifungal to apply this flexible approach. And I sought the advice of our advisory committee, and they completely supported using this approach in the antifungal space as well. The second approval this year was Zacduro. That's a co-packaged product containing sulbactam, beta-lactam antibacterial and beta-lactase inhibitor, and durlobactam, a beta-lactamase inhibitor. And that's indicated in adults for the treatment of hospital-acquired bacterial pneumonia and ventilator-associated bacterial pneumonia, but this time caused by a specific phenotype, and that is Acinetobacter baumannii calcoaceticus complex. That was a single trial with a wider pre-specified NI margin, but actually at the end of the day made a 3.5% margin, so fairly tight. Let's just talk a little bit about the LPAD pathway now, which kind of builds on this paradigm that really had been implemented prior to the LPAD enabling statutes. And that was of course established by the Cures Act. We last issued guidance on this in 2020, August of 2020. That's been updated. And LPAD seeks to provide an approval pathway for these drugs intended to treat a serious or life-threatening infection in a limited population of unmet need. But the drug must be intended for use in a limited population of patients. And we interpret that limited population to mean a group of patients that's limited in a way that's clinically relevant to healthcare providers. The labeling defines that population well, and so that the healthcare provider would be able to identify these patients. So basically, these are for drugs where FDA is able to conclude a positive benefit risk balance in the limited population, even though insufficient data exists to conclude that there is a favorable benefit risk profile in a broader population. We had an LPAD approval recently that was DefenCath. It's a combination of toluridine, which is antimicrobial, and heparin. And that's indicated to reduce the incidence of catheter-related bloodstream infections in adult patients with kidney failure receiving chronic hemodialysis through a central venous catheter. And the limitation is that, and the company chose this pathway because they wanted to clearly communicate that there isn't data to support its use in other types of catheters right now. So that's an example of LPAD. I did want to highlight two things we're working on now because we're never done, and I think it's helpful to know kind of what's at least on my priority list. So our first project is going to be looking at development challenges for drugs to treat rare mold infections. There's really a need to understand registries and other resources that might serve as an external control, and identify opportunities to enhance those resources. And we're about to begin a fellowship collaboration with the Antibiotic Resistance Leadership Group, which is funded by NIH, to begin to focus on in this space. Also, we held a joint workshop with CDC on prevention of infections in the healthcare setting. And that discussion highlighted the need to synthesize the data regarding the clinical benefit of decolonization strategies in different clinical situations, hopefully to facilitate more feasible clinical trials in this space. And we're very excited that BARDA was able to fund a large project that will seek to advance regulatory science in this area. So just wanted to touch on those because our work is never done.
Well, you said it absolutely perfectly and actually teed us up quite well for the conversations that we hope to have for the rest of this webinar, which really is a deep dive into the evidence that will be needed by different stakeholders, the clinical trials, and what kind of evidentiary needs are along the way, and then also what kind of collaborations are in place, and what we kind of see on the horizon. So thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you very much also for sharing with us your priorities, because we agree that the work is never done. And we appreciate all that you're doing for the agency and for speaking with us today.
Thanks, it was great to be here. Appreciate it.
I'm now going to transition to our panel discussion. We're joined by experts with varied experience working to support the availability of novel antibiotic drugs. During our discussion, we'll hear more about policy approaches to advance partnerships, clinical trials, evidence development, and regulatory practices to sustain novel antibiotic innovation. I'm pleased to introduce Erin Duffy, joins us from CARB-X. Erin is the Chief of Research and Development at CARB-X, a global partnership that aims to address the threat of antibiotic resistance by providing funding for companies with innovative and promising solutions for antibiotic resistance. Anthony McDonnell joins us from the Center for Global Development. Anthony is a senior policy analyst on the global health team at the Center for Global Development and was the technical lead for his center's recent report, A New Grand Bargain to Improve the Antimicrobial Market for Human Health. Sumati Nambiar joins us from Johnson & Johnson. Sumati is a senior director in the Child Health Innovation and Leadership Department at Johnson & Johnson. She is board certified in pediatrics and pediatric infectious diseases, is a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and has over 20 years of experience in drug development and regulatory science. And Tammy Pillay joins us from the Global Antibiotic R&D Partnership. Tammy is the head of Global Regulatory Affairs at the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, a nonprofit organization that works to accelerate the development and access of treatment for drug resistance infections. We have everyone on the screen. Wonderful. All right. I'm going to begin by just asking our speakers to take a few minutes to highlight or preview any key ideas that are important to today's topics. And a quick reminder to our audience that you're welcome to submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll try our best to incorporate that into our open discussion near the end. Anthony, I hope it's okay if I begin with you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Marianne. So hello, I'm Anthony, as you heard. I'm an economist by background, so my take on this will be about how we improve investment and reduce costs to getting new drugs out into the market. And I guess I've got four or so takeaways that I'm interested here today. The first one, and I think most important in some ways, is that we need to harmonize regulation between different jurisdictions far more than we do at the moment, for two reasons. First of all, many countries in the world don't get access to novel antibiotics. Indeed, the vast majority of countries don't get access to even half the new antibiotics that come on to approval. New companies have to register products in something like 160 jurisdictions. Often there is different requirements, slightly different paperwork, and it's maddeningly complex for often very small bureaucratic reasons. And this just makes it very hard to get drugs to people who need them in the world. The United States is the one country that in some ways avoids this, in that all drugs more or less get registered here if they get registered anywhere. But even here, the lack of harmonization of regulation hurts Americans for one simple reason. The less countries you can sell your drug in, the less money you're going to make from selling it, and thus the less profitable it is. Which means that something that might be profitable if you could sell it in 20 countries won't be profitable only selling it in the United States, and thus doesn't get taken forward. But by regulatory harmonization, America can work with other partners, particularly partners in high-income countries, to register products more, and then we can all buy antibiotics together, hopefully. The second thing I think it's worth considering in all of this is kind of a question of trade-offs. And there's certainly an argument that I'm sympathetic to, which is that we have become very good in health regulation at stopping people from taking products that might cause them some kind of risk or harm. But we do this to the detriment sometimes of getting by getting rid of things that actually do work, because we plausibly set the bar too high. And so this is particularly true of antibiotics, where it's very hard to prove that a new antibiotic is superior against a resistant strain of bacteria, because often the resistant strains of bacteria we're looking at aren't very prevalent in the world, or they're only prevalent in some parts of the world, or they're in a hospital as an outbreak, but the hospital does everything it can to get rid of the outbreak. And so by the time you've got your trial set up in that hospital, it's already gone from there and you need to go somewhere else. And we don't want to wait until these pathogens are very widespread before we start working out what works in approving drugs. We want some things there as a backup defense, and regulation makes that quite challenging. Instead, I would say that we can do far more with, first of all, animal studies to authorize whether something is effective. We need to make sure it's safe, but whether it's effective against resistant pathogens. And then also post-market approval, where we can check whether drugs are actually working in the community and in hospitals as well as we expected them to, and withdraw drugs that aren't. Now, if we are lowering the standard of efficacy, as has been done already in some cases like the GAIN Act, which made it easier for drugs to be approved, it is important that we do have that post-market approval, because we do need to make sure things actually work in the long run. And that's key to getting things like market entry rewards and the PASTEUR Act and these big investments that we want governments to make in new drugs to work, because we need to know which drugs are good. And then the final thing I want to touch on very briefly is diagnostics. The regulatory system at the moment doesn't work as well as it should for diagnostics. Often, indeed, almost always with bacterial infections, a diagnostic is just a tool that gives a doctor more information to make the best decision for the patient. Ultimately, it is the doctor who still decides whether or not you get an antibiotic and which antibiotic you get. And so, in my view, they should be regulated with that standard of evidence in mind. It is a tool to help doctors, that you want to make sure the tool is not flawed or fraudulent in any way, but it is simply a tool. But often at the moment, it is treated to the standard of something that will definitely change patient behavior. And so we need to be certain that everything it says is right. I think that's too high a standard, particularly because at the moment, doctors often have to make prescription decisions with very little information with the patient who's presented to them. And so the standard for a diagnostic to be good is really just, does it help the doctor make a slightly better decision? Thank you very much. I'm really very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Anthony. Tammy, do you mind sharing key ideas related to today's topics?
So good morning to everyone. I'm Tammy Pillay and I come from GARD-P. So, we know antibiotic resistance is a huge global health problem, and it's demanding effective regulatory systems that balance both the patient safety while driving innovation. So improving regulatory standards is critical to the long-term viability of antibiotic innovation. There are several strategies to consider improving regulatory practices in this area, but I will just touch on 3. The first one being the public-private partnerships. Here, GARD-P is a player, so we foster collaborations between government agencies, academia, and the private sector to pool our resources, our expertise, market access, distribution, and funding for both antibiotic research and development. The second is global collaboration of regulatory agencies. And here we need to encourage and strengthen international cooperation among regulatory agencies, because this will harmonize standards and facilitate the approval process, across multiple regions, and also to prevent duplication of efforts and accelerate access to new antibiotics worldwide. Further, we need to build on this information sharing and transparency of agencies, capacity building, and training of the LMIC agencies. The third one is flexible trial designs, like adaptive trial designs, which allow for more flexibility in testing antibiotics. Here, they enable modifications to various aspects of a trial, such as the sample size, the treatment arms, the patient allocation, or even endpoints based on accumulating data. And I think this, will enable quick identification of effective compounds and potentially reduce antibiotic development costs. By employing strategies and continuously refining regulatory practices, I think we can create an environment that supports both antibiotic innovation while ensuring the responsible use of these crucial medications. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sumati.
Great. Thanks, Marianne. Thank you again for this opportunity to present some of my thoughts. And really, these are based on my perspectives as a pediatrician, as an infectious disease doctor, a former regulator, and now a member of the pharmaceutical industry. I'll start off with my disclaimer, which is that the views are mine and not that of my employer. Maybe I'm a bit of an outlier amongst the panelists today because I'm going to really focus on pediatrics. I think it's a vulnerable population in whom a medical need for innovative therapies exists just as in adults. And the status quo with 5 to 10 year delays in pediatric approvals, I don't think is the way to go moving forward. So I think our current one-size-fits-all approach is one of the key issues that's leading to the delays in development of antibacterial drugs for the pediatric population, particularly for those with the greatest unmet need. I think a more flexible approach in designing pediatric programs that take into consideration the attributes of the molecule, its potential to address unmet need are critical, and also to the extent possible that these trials be pragmatic. I think we should also consider if there are specific situations where we can live with smaller amounts of data. Again, an approach not dissimilar from that being followed for adults, where there is really an unmet need and streamlined development programs are acceptable. I think both Tammy and Anthony have touched upon this. I think to the extent possible, achieving regulatory alignment with the requirements and streamlining the processes can certainly help advancing therapies for children, particularly in a global setting. I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of work has been done in this area, but certainly more needs to be done, particularly to bring on board and seek alignment among other national regulatory authorities to ensure that we have feasible agreements around approaches for global pediatric development. While a single pediatric program and a unified global approach is ideal, and maybe we're not there yet, I think at least a good starting point would be to have in place more nimble mechanisms that will help address divergent opinions and seek alignment for a single global program. And then use of existing pathways and use of such as collaborative registration pathways and others, I think can facilitate, bring regulatory authorities from LMICs into this discussion and be part of designing what a pediatric development program should look like. I think we've heard about the need to improve trial processes and other trial efficiencies. I think particularly relevant in pediatrics, where you want to reduce the burden on children and their parents. I think one other important consideration is the inclusion of adolescents in the phase 3 trials. And I think this can really play an important role in advancing innovative new medicines. I think we all would acknowledge and agree that there are challenges in including adolescents in adult trials, but it has been done. And I think it has shown us that it is possible to design and execute phase 3 trials, which actually include adolescents. So I think that, over the years, we've certainly made progress in that, but it almost should be the default position. And if adolescents are excluded, I think there should be a good justification for why that's the case for the particular disease in question. Quickly, the next topic that I'll just touch upon is the importance of incorporating patient voice in antibacterial trials. Certainly from a pediatric perspective, there's a need to better incorporate the voice of parents and children, and that of the youth population in the design of our clinical trials, particularly trials done across the globe. Many pediatric trials struggle with recruitment because the protocol design is just not suitable for the child or for the parent. Again, in a global setting, it needs to be really looked into. And I think for adult antibacterial trials, it's certainly encouraging to see that there is more engagement from parents or caregivers, including consideration for novel endpoints. But again, I think there's more work to be done to enhance patient engagement, really taking into consideration the diverse patient population that participates in these trials. This has been done in other therapeutic areas, and we can take the lead from that and incorporate this into infectious disease trials as well. Maybe I took more than 3 or 4 minutes of my allotted time. With that, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks, Marian.
Thank you so much. All right, Erin.
I'll give Samadi time any time of day. So thank you very much for including me today. My name is Erin Duffy, and I work for Carbex, as you heard. Just to remind or maybe inform if you don't know, but Carbex invests both financially and with support models for product developers to deliver new therapeutics, including antibiotics, preventatives, including but not limited to vaccines and rapid diagnostics, all for AMR. I mentioned the support model because, yes, everybody knows that we give financial support for groups to bring products from hit to lead through to a demonstration of safety in humans. But part of the reason that we're here, in fact, a lot of the reason that we're here, is that most of this work is being done by very small product developers who are typically excellent at the foundational technology, but lack the breadth and depth of expertise to do drug discovery, let alone drug development. And so we have a multi-layer model. And while I won't describe all of that, I will describe a few things related in particular to regulatory science. So as it is the case that we fund programs through to a demonstration of safety in humans, one could say, well, there's a lot more that has to be done to the opposite side of you to bring a product then to the market, and that is true. But we take our role seriously, and so as programs are coming forward to that first in human study, we want to make sure that they've thought almost in a Merlin exercise from what we want our label to look like back to what do the clinical and non-clinical aspects of a phase 1 program need to look like, both to be convincing to advanced product developer to take it on, but then also to set a path for regulatory and clinical success. And so I'm going to mention a few things here because I think they're important, and actually everybody's already touched on them in one way or another. Today, I think our therapeutics portfolio is, oh goodness, probably 75 to 80% with non-traditional programs. So when I say that, I mean your non-direct acting classical small molecule antibiotics. And that's not through any active choice. We wanted to emphasize both treatment in the traditional sense and non-traditional sense, to have multiple tools for fighting AMR. But here we are with this very large non-traditional portfolio, which in most cases will have to be used adjunctive to standard of care. And so it brings up the natural question, how are we going to develop this to show the benefit over standard of care? What regulatory practices, guidances, trial designs exist, and how can we best move forward? And in some cases, there really aren't good trial designs, particularly in superiority designs. And so this year, we actually nucleated a working group of experts, largely clinicians, to start having conversations around clinical trial designs for superiority. In October at our product developer conference, we did have that group read out 2 trial designs, one for prosthetic joint infections and another for pneumonia. And a lot of our programs in the portfolio are focused in that area. A second thing that I will say is that even for your direct acting small molecule antibiotics, to be able to demonstrate robustness, not only to treat infections caused by susceptible organisms, but also by resistant organisms. And we heard a little of this earlier. How do you find those patients? And so one of the things that we've been doing is engaging with clinical trial networks, for instance, Advance ID, led by David Patterson, to ask the question, if we do studies with you in the regions of the world that you're able to access, what are the patient types that we can access? What's the epidemiology in those areas? And can we, in fact, help to support studies that will gain that label for drug-resistant bacteria? Another thing, and John Farley mentioned this earlier, following the workshop that the FDA co-led with the CDC last year, and recognizing that in our prevention portfolio are several products, potential products focused on gut decolonization, we embraced the notion of needing to gather an evidence base and help engage with regulators to provide information and endpoints that could then lead to trial designs for approval. And so we had applied to the CDC to do this evidence-based gathering work as a first step towards this. But in the end, BARDA, who is one of our funders, did give us a supplement to start this work. And so we'll be convening this work shortly with a variety of groups at Boston University, which is where we're housed, as well as Duke, Mass General, and Tufts. And so we hope to amass this evidence base and have a conversation about where we might go forward. And then finally, the one thing I will say about diagnostics, and we embrace diagnostics because we recognize the need to be able to say confidently what a patient has, and therefore how they can be treated, or he or she can be treated. But a big challenge with bringing forward diagnostics, and Anthony touched on this a little bit, actually, is the amount of information that's needed. And one particular area is the number of clinical samples that are needed for these product developers and diagnostics to be able to gain approval. And in some cases, these samples aren't retained. The isolates are, but not the samples. And this is something that we really need to work on to help our product developers advance in a non-geologic time frame. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank all of the panelists for your opening remarks. And we have a lot to dive into. I'd like to begin by asking about antibiotic development from the perspective of the global marketplace. We've heard a lot about this already in some of the opening comments, especially Tammy and Anthony. I think my first question would be, how do regulatory frameworks influence investment in antibiotic development? And how antibiotics are made available in different countries. And then Sumanti, I want to add an additional layer. If we're looking at regulatory frameworks, what should we be thinking about from a pediatrician or pediatric perspective? So I'll start that. Anthony, Tammy?
Tammy, happy to go first. Or...
Okay, so I'll go first. I think, so when it comes to this role of clinical trials, in antibiotics among the different countries, then it becomes quite multifaceted, right? So for the efficacy and the safety evaluation, but if these clinical trials are conducted across multiple countries, then it allows for a diverse patient population. And this then, helps us to understand how the different demographics and regions respond to such antibiotic. In terms of the regulatory approval, when we seek regulatory approval for a new antibiotic, the data from these clinical trials that was conducted in multiple countries can now support the submissions to regulatory bodies in the various regions. And that shows how the harmonization ensures that the data generated from these trials align with the standards that's set by the different regulatory authorities. And it actually expedites the approval process. And the other bit I would like to touch on is the global health impact. I think, when it comes to these international trials, they contribute significantly to address global health concerns, especially in regions where we know infectious diseases are prevalent and these antibiotics are needed. So by conducting these trials in areas with high incidence of certain infections, researchers can then better understand the effectiveness these antibiotics have against specific pathogens prevalent in those regions. So those are the points I would have liked to have touched on. Thanks.
Thank you. Anthony?
Great, thank you very much. And thank you, Tammy, for framing a lot of that already. So I think the first one part of your question was, how does this impact access? And the short answer is hugely. The vast majority of new drugs only get registered in the United States of America and maybe 3 or 4 other countries. You get wealthy countries like Sweden, who have to come up with a new way of purchasing drugs just to make sure that it is in companies' interest to sell drugs there. And that's not only a regulatory problem, it's kind of a twofold problem. One, the market for antibiotics isn't very big. And secondly, there are regulatory hurdles. Now, you could make the market for antibiotics bigger by spending more money, or we could reduce some of the regulatory barriers. But it seems sensible to me that as much as is safe and prudent, it seems better to reduce red tape than to spend money to increase the size of these markets. This second thing you asked about was how does this impact R&D? And as I mentioned earlier, if the United States is 15–16% of the global economy, if you only have that and maybe a couple more countries like involved in purchasing these antibiotics, then there is a much smaller reserve there to pay for new drugs than there would be if regulatory harmonization allowed drugs to be registered everywhere. But also the types of drugs the United States needs are often quite different from what are needed in low and middle income countries. The US is a very developed country. It's got a very good healthcare system. It has better diagnostics available to doctors than in most of the world. So it means that reserve very narrow spectrum drugs are often the drugs that are most in demand by public health people in the United States, often used by an IV line, while oral treatments are often in greater demand in poorer parts of the world. And if people can't register products in those parts of the world and they're relying on the US market to drive innovation, then I think that creates a problem. And the final thing I'll say is if you look at the parts of the world that have the greatest burden of resistance, they are not Europe, North America, they're parts of South and Southeast Asia. Even if we were only being very selfish, and I say this as a European, but it's equally true as an American, even if we only cared about ourselves, the pathogens that are more prevalent in those parts of the world are likely to become more prevalent here at some point. So working with those countries to create a market that treats their needs and develop the drugs that they need will mean that as those pathogens become more prevalent here, we will be much more likely to have a treatment available to act.
Yeah, so Marianne, I think both Tammy and Anthony have covered most of what I wanted to say. And I think the issues at large for antibacterials, I think they're magnified a few-fold than when it relates to children and the needs for pediatric patients. Infections due to resistant organisms, parts of the world where these resistance phenotypes are much more common, unfairly affect the most vulnerable of the pediatric populations, which are the youngest neonates. And they invariably are the last to get studied. And by the time a new drug is developed and approved for adults in the United States, and then it's approved in pediatric populations and it gets to neonates, we are talking about a decade. And then if there is a further requirement to study children from these specific countries, because there are regulatory requirements to do so, I think it then just further delays availability of these therapies to children most in need. So really, just as with adults, with pediatrics, to the extent possible, we as a community should focus towards a single global trial that actually has representation from patients across the globe. We just cannot do a pediatric trial to meet regulatory requirements in the US and the EU because there are requirements, and then forget about the rest of the world, or then require additional pediatric trials to meet regulatory requirements in other parts of the world. So in my mind, the issues are the same, whether it's adults or pediatrics, it's just magnified a few-fold when you start talking about the needs of children.
Well, thank you for that. But what you've all outlined is that there needs to be some better alignment across many, many different regulatory authorities. So I guess my question back is what next steps could be taken to align or harmonize these regulatory requirements among different regulatory authorities across all these countries who are looking at different populations and different economies? And what could be some of the anticipated benefits? I think you've already mentioned that we could get to trials faster. We could see populations all represented. How do we get there? What are some steps that would allow us to have that conversation in a more international way?
Well, I am not a regulator anymore, so I really can't speak on their behalf. But I think there are opportunities for us to be able to achieve alignment. And I understand everybody has to work within their specific regulatory frameworks and the requirements are different. And so it's maybe a bit too ambitious to expect that across the board, there will be alignment from the start. But maybe there are areas that we can identify where there is a reasonable likelihood of achieving alignment and prioritize and start somewhere and then sort of build upon it. That's one potential approach. There are mechanisms or reliance pathways. There are mechanisms where you can get regulatory input into development programs, has been done, particularly with neglected tropical diseases. Maybe antibiotics fit that bill as well, where you can actually have some of the regulators from some of the low and middle income countries where the disease burden might be high as part of the conversations that companies are having with say, EMA, for example. So I think there are mechanisms in place that I suppose we can experiment and see if they fit well in the antibacterial space and then continue to build. I just don't think we have all the solutions just right off the bat, but I think we have enough to get us started and then continue to build from our experience.
Yeah, and I would just like to add on to what Samati said. I think, you know, this global regulatory networks, we need to encourage that the creation of these networks and forums, you know, where regulatory agencies from the different regions actually collaborate and share information and align standards. And, you know, I know WHO is supporting this platform and is trying to coordinate efforts to set global guidelines for antibiotic approval. But I think a lot more work needs to be done there. And then the other point that I had touched on was the information sharing and transparency. So we need to encourage this scientific data and research findings among the regulatory bodies, you know, to facilitate decision making. And we need to create platforms and databases where this information on approved antibiotics and their efficacy, you know, can be accessed globally. And then the last one is, I feel, is more on the capacity building and training. So we need to provide more support and resources to these LMIC regulatory agencies so that they can enhance their capacity for reviewing and approving antibiotics. You can also offer training programs and workshops to try and harmonize their understanding in line with international studies. But these are just some at the top of my head. Marianne, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I would definitely like to support your last point there, Tammy, about the education and open discussion. And the other thing I'll say, and this is part of what we've been doing at CARB-X as we convene these workshops to discuss clinical trial designs, is to bring different regulatory bodies and different clinician phenotypes to the table and have these discussions so that the work product actually is a synthesis of what people feel can be done across these agencies, and also to debunk some myths. So maybe I'm the only person on this call, but last week I happened to be in Japan for some meetings, and I spent the morning at the PMDA. And I've been operating under the assumption my entire career that in order to have a drug approved in Japan, you had to do clinical studies in Japan. Not true, it turns out. So unless there's, some drug-drug interaction that would be, concerning to the population, and that, early, from your preclinical and first in human studies, they don't require it, okay? So there's another geography that all of a sudden opens up from regulatory review of a dossier from another regulator. And I think the more we can learn about what everybody does and maybe get rid of some myths, the easier path we might have.
Yes, so just a comment, Erin, I'm happy to hear that, hear of the work that you're doing. I also wanted to check with you, is in these conversations, I hope there is an opportunity to also bring in what is the clinical need in those specific areas, what is it that patients would require in those specific areas. So then at the end, you can have a good amalgamation of the viewpoints from different parts of the world. And I would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's great point, Smati. And the answer is, I don't think we're expert at it today, but it's something that, we're learning, more and more every day. I think, let's be honest, that Lancet publication of last year, if you weren't paying attention, and Anthony mentioned this before, but, where the problem really is, I think we all now know, but then the question is, what are the right products and how do we get there, to your point? And so, there are a variety of things that can be done, including, and, I know this means different things to different people, but market shaping activities. And I don't mean that in a negative light, but again, what are the performance characteristics of the product that's going to really drive that uptake, and how do we best build it in early and then shine a light on it in the clinical studies.
The one thing I might quickly add to all of the technical, or the reason for doing this, I completely agree with the other three panelists. I guess the one thing to add is, I think the politics is actually quite tricky for a couple of reasons. First of all, the countries that benefit most in the world from regulatory harmonization are small countries, which products are least likely to be registered in, and the countries that benefit least are big countries like the United States, particularly the United States. And generally, countries that lead global conversations tend to be the big ones. And I suspect that's part of the reason that this hasn't happened. There's also, we don't currently live in an era where people are jumping to have global solutions to global problems. I mean, you see that in many countries, including where I live, the UK, and where most of you live in the United States. And then there's a large, I think, amount of discontent that has been generated by COVID-19 and what happened to COVID-19 vaccines, and distrust between low and middle and high income countries. And so getting them to work together and harmonize regulation is hard, and we probably shouldn't be too hopeful with how quickly this can move forward. My goal, and I think the best approach, would be a global regulatory harmonization, but it is worth thinking as a second option that is much better than the status quo is also regional regulation, and have things like an African Medicines Agency that can register products on behalf of countries across African continent, and also can follow up and do kind of the post-market approval studies that several of us have talked about, and do check the quality of manufacturing that Tammy mentioned earlier, that is quite hard for small regulators to do. And then maybe you end up in a world where you've got PAHO and the African Medicines Agency, and European Medical Agency already exists, and in a way it's a good template of how you can get 27 countries, which each still have their own regulatory system, to come together and create a framework that is far easier than it would be than the old system to work together. And so I do think the reason we don't have this already isn't because it's not a very good idea. It's because it is hard, and people value sovereignty and control over things, and working with other countries creates challenges politically.
Right. Well, thank you for these comments. I want to shift just a moment to something we've talked around quite a bit, and that is, let's talk about clinical trials. And there can be challenges related to the rareness of resistant infections. There's small patient populations. Samati keeps highlighting that we have to think about the pediatric populations. It's difficult designing studies that lead to clear and meaningful clinical guidance for novel antibiotics. So, and also kind of thinking about what John was talking about at the beginning, where we also have just really rare populations, and whether there's some unmet needs that kind of add another layer of urgency. So how can researchers ensure that there's a robustness in clinical trials involving especially small patient populations, especially with those with rare drug resistance infections?
So one thing that you get in a slightly different world of pandemics is to create new, say, vaccine for Ebola. If there's not an Ebola outbreak at the moment, we don't generate an Ebola vaccine and then test whether the vaccine works, because we can't test whether the vaccine works because nobody has Ebola at the moment. But what we can do is test whether it works in animals. We can run lots of different studies on the vaccine and get a sense of whether it might work, and then have it ready to be rolled out quite quickly in a world which there's an Ebola outbreak. And I raise this because I think sometimes we get too focused on running very expensive trials on a very small number of patients. And we're not doing it we're mostly doing it because we're worried about a greater outbreak of that resistant infection. We can probably run larger trials to show that efficacy against drug-susceptible infections, and safety, and have drugs ready to be tested, and do those post-market studies, which tend to be cheaper and easier, on those small groups that are so hard to track down, and to determine whether or not the drug really provides the evidence that we need.
Yeah, I think a couple of things I'll say there is, certainly I think historically people have felt comfortable in the infectious disease space, and antibacterial infectious disease space in particular, that animal models of infection are often indicative of what you're going to see clinically. And I think, though, we're learning that may be true and that may not be true. And I give you, for instance, we've had what I think 3 failures recently, phase 3 failures of antibiotics for urinary tract infections when they all work like gangbusters in the animal. Okay. And so I think part of what you're seeing, and there are a number of groups doing this, we're involved in a consortium looking at lung models, which is to try to do the hard work of standardization and validation through back translation with clinically used antibiotics to try to bolster what we know about animal models so that, to Anthony's point, you can feel more confidently in that translation. But I will say, and I come back to this in terms of finding the populations with drug resistance, I do think this is where these emerging clinical trial networks in different regions of the world can really be helpful, so that we're not scaring up one patient every 3 years that's relevant for a clinical trial, but in fact can be and be there confidently and credibly where the patients are. And I think this is emerging and evolving, and I think it's all very positive for those of us who are either developing or supporting developers in these arenas.
Yeah, and I would just like to come in. Earlier I mentioned the whole flexible trial designs, like the adaptive trial designs. And one of the key areas at GARD-P is that we're looking at repurposing or revisiting older antibiotics for both adult and for pediatric populations. And because of the rise of this antibiotic resistance, we feel now that we should provide alternative choices for treating these bacterial infections. So we're looking at antibiotic treatments or regimes that was not previously there, but it's just a combination of these older antibiotics. And also because the older antibiotics, are frequently off patent and less expensive than the more modern drugs. Therefore, it's, makes it more accessible for companies to actually try and do these clinical trials with new antibiotic regimes. So that's another way of trying to address this whole rise in antibiotic resistance without new antibiotics, but rather just repurposing the older medication.
Yeah, so Marian, just one comment. I think it was very encouraging to hear John speak earlier about the work they're planning to undertake to address rare or difficult to treat molds. I think we need to, as a community, as a group, identify some clinical conditions where there truly is a clinical need, but they really cannot be studied in the traditional development programs and will not be studied in the traditional ways antibacterial drugs are studied. And how much of, really what are the issues? Is it about the endpoint? Is it about the trial design? And how much of uncertainty are we willing to take in these programs? So I think we need to come together to have a discussion around that, because otherwise we only talk about 2 or 3 indications, which is what companies can do to get approval. But there is a gap between that and what is actually needed clinically and what's really of importance to patients. So how do we bridge that gap? What might be conditions that really we need to focus on? And how do we design? Because as Erin has already said, these trials are very difficult to design. So if it was easy, we would have all come up with solutions by now. But we need to come together, put our heads together, and be willing to accept some degree of uncertainty given the state of knowledge. Start somewhere and then maybe continue to improve, because this has to be an iterative process.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Samadhi, and even, coming back, for instance, to the prevention arena and gut decolonization. So, finding what best shows clinical benefit, what best correlates with clinical benefit, I think is, really going to be, an important thing to do. And along the path to not be burdened by what we think we know. And translate from small molecule development, and be willing to be surprised. But a corollary to this is choosing the right patient population to demonstrate this in, a nice closed population where you can actually ask the questions where the signal to noise ratio isn't so large that there's in the end nothing that's going to point to a direction that's meaningful.
All right, thank you. Before we leave clinical trials, both Erin and Anthony both mentioned diagnostics in your opening comments. do you have any thoughts about how bacterial diagnostics could be employed to achieve adequate and meaningful clinical trial enrollments?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just jump in. Sorry, I'm a little type A today. Apologies for that. But our entire strategy at Carbex, we've branded aligned by design. And the reason we did that was to say we're going to invest in diagnostics, not for the coolest technology, although that's nice, but rather specifically for the conduct of clinical trials of our treatment and prevention portfolio, and then the on-market uptake of them after approval, both of which are actually challenges in this arena. And so it's critical, particularly as I've said, a number of our non-traditional products. How are you going to find the patients, and then how are you going to demonstrate success? And that requires having a diagnostic to enroll the right patients quickly. And so our goals then are finding those appropriate sample types, technology at the right levels of the healthcare system, and then a turnaround time that's meaningful for the conduct of a clinical trial.
Yeah, I'll just add to Erin. I think it's hard to understate how much of a game changer good diagnostics will be. As Erin mentioned, they will greatly reduce the cost of trials. They will make it much easier to protect drugs because we will only give drugs to people who need them. I mean, I'm talking like we're years away from this, but a high-end antibiotic that can test susceptibility and can ensure that we get patients the best treatment that they need very quickly so they don't waste time being on the wrong drug. And there are lots of technical challenges with getting there, which is why part of the reason we don't have them at the moment. But I do think that we need to be more imaginative and probably less risk averse in how we take these approvals forward. Because as I said in my opening remarks, the idea that these are going to fully unilaterally decide patients' treatment is often the standard that they're judged against. While in practice, we're still going to have doctors, they're still going to be very well trained and brilliant in their field. And this is one data point amongst so many that they can take into account. And hopefully that will make them make, even if it's only marginally better decisions, that is a good thing. But we shouldn't expect them to be perfect. And more importantly, even if they are perfect, we shouldn't make them have to prove that they're perfect, which is no easy task in order to get them rolled out.
No, I just want to highlight one other thing. John Farley did mention this product in his remarks, but I think we could all learn a lot from what was a partnership between the company that was Entasis and bioMérieux in the conduct of the pivotal phase 3 study for sulbactam, durlobactam against Acinetobacter. So, nobody walks into the ER saying, I got an Acinetobacter infection. So they needed that partnership with bioMérieux, and that's how they were successful. And I'm sure it wasn't easy and they're trailblazing there, but I certainly feel we could learn a lot from them as a community.
Excellent, thank you. Another topic that I want to pick up from an earlier theme is the use of real-world evidence for clinical trials. And I think the question for all of you is, how can real-world evidence be leveraged to augment the regulatory review and enhance the clinical utility of novel antibiotics? Okay.
I'll get started. I'm not an expert on real-world evidence, but I think really this is one topic where the devil is in the details, right? What do you mean by real-world evidence? What is the quality of the data? That's what it really boils down to. What's the quality of the data? What can it tell you? Is it interpretable? And then you decide in what setting it's a good fit. If it is for primarily supporting approval, then obviously the requirements on the quality, the types of data would be rather different than if it is in a more of a supportive role. So it's just hard to, if the answer to the question, does real-world evidence have a role? I think the answer is yes, but it really depends on in what setting, what kinds of data we're talking about. So it's kind of hard to give a blanket statement. But again, if I had to continue on my theme of advocating for children, I think there is a potential role for real-world evidence, because particularly in infectious diseases, for the most part, we're able to extrapolate efficacy and safety. So what we really need is a lot of pharmacokinetic data and some safety information to be able to treat children. But there might be a role to collect additional data. There might be an additional role for real-world evidence here to continue to collect data in the post-approval setting to then maybe inform our continued use of the product, maybe inform labeling updates. So I do think that there is a role for RWE. We just have to define what we mean by it and in what setting.
Do others have anything to add?
Yeah, almost all regulators in high-income countries already use real-world evidence for adverse events. You need kind of, if something has a 1 in 100 chance of being an adverse event for somebody, you need 300 people in a trial to be confident, or to have 95% confidence that you'll select that up. And so unless you're going to run 30,000 person trial, you are never going to find something in a clinical trial with confidence that happens once every 10,000 times, for example. So we've created these systems already for monitoring drugs once they go out in terms of safety. And I guess the thing I would say that we need to try and think more about in antimicrobial resistance is building on efficacy, and for two reasons, as has come up many times today. It makes it easier to find those patients, and that's a good thing. But the second thing is that antimicrobial resistance isn't static. People who have hypertension today and people who have hypertension in 10 years' time are likely to be quite similar. While somebody who has a UTI today and a UTI in 10 years' time is often going to have quite a different infection and different resistance profiles. And so we need to be collecting evidence in general to know which of our drugs are working well, which of them aren't, which will mean that we have a better sense of which drugs to produce and how to treat people. So regardless of innovation, I think we should be building this infrastructure and we should be leveraging this data, because drugs go into far more people in the real world than they go into in the clinic, in clinical trials. But while we're doing that, making clinical trials easier and cheaper and improving the evidence that we will ultimately get and reducing the cost of it, those seem like no-brainers.
Well, even as a no-brainer, do you feel as if the AMR research community has that alignment with data generators and aggregators, that they understand kind of the complexity, the uniqueness of the kind of the infectious diseases versus your more chronic diseases? And if not, how do we begin that conversation?
I'm maybe not the best person in the panel to answer this, but it does feel like we're moving that way. We've improved antibiotics with less stringent on the efficacy side trials now than we did 20 years ago. Things like GAIN have made it much easier, but have also meant that we have less information than we maybe once had on high resistance strains and how well drugs do against them. And I think that is a sensible shift to move into real world information. I think plausibly you could argue that we have not done the second step of that well enough, which is to go then and find out enough about these drugs once that they're approved. And that makes it easier. And I think there is general buy-in, particularly around things like the Pasteur Act, and that if you're going to have something like that, then you're going to need to generate more evidence on how good a product is. Then you're likely to get in a clinical trial. And the US government, if it was going to sign up to pay somebody or a company $2 or $3 billion over 10 years, probably wants to make sure the product is actually doing what they wanted to do over the course of those 10 years. And so I think there is a general move in this direction, but maybe not as fast as some of us would like.
And then Tammy, back to your conversation earlier around kind of the kind of complications in clinical trials expansion within other countries and more globally, do you see a role for real world evidence collection as a way to build us towards more alignments internationally, or do we still have a ways to go kind of in the US first before that becomes something that's more of an international focus?
Yeah, I think when it comes to real world evidence, absolutely. I mean, apart from the post-market evidence, it's also the pharmacovigilance, right? So this needs to address the trade-off between ensuring that the medication is safe and making the treatments available. So I'm actually based in Johannesburg in South Africa. So when it comes to the African continent, we've just started to acknowledge and work into the full pharmacovigilance space. So building on training and the capacity building on the regulatory agencies in Africa to ensure that this whole pharmacovigilance and the ADR reporting the data is collected, it is analyzed by the agency, and that information, is shared to the public if need be. So I think in terms of the US, yeah, you've come a long way, but for the rest of the world, especially in the low and middle income countries, there's still some way to go. And, we look to the north to help strengthen these agencies down south, and also, to share your experiences on where you've come with collecting, detecting, assessing and preventing any of these adverse effects or any drug-related problems, and also sharing your learnings when it comes to both pharmacovigilance and in the post-market evidence development. Yeah.
Thank you. With the time I have left, I do want to hear a bit more about non-traditional antibiotics, something that, Erin, you certainly mentioned in our opening comments, but these options may or may not be well served by existing regulatory frameworks. So I think just a question for all of you is, do regulatory requirements challenge the development of non-traditional antibiotics? And, if so, where should we begin that discussion?
Well, I guess the short answer to your question is yes.
Right.
But I think again, the question is, because often these are, not antibiotics themselves, they don't kill bacteria, so they will be used adjunctively to standard of care. And so then the question is, what are acceptable endpoints that demonstrate benefit of X plus standard of care over standard of care? And that's where, again, getting creative about endpoints, but making sure they're meaningful, and what that means, I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of, I'm sure you've heard these terms like DOOR and radar, so different, outcomes that measure success that isn't necessarily all-cause mortality or, reduction in bacterial burden as the key to success, but, other outcomes of the patient. And I just think we're going to have to see some of these studies and see how effective, where things are effective and where they're not before we can, say the problem is solved. Good news is that there are enough programs that are advanced enough that are starting to scratch this door, where I think we're going to learn something. And I'll highlight one because I'd be remiss if I didn't. But a program for which we supported the first in human is an antivirulence program of GlaxoSmithKline, which is looking at a FIMH antagonist for the prevention of recurrent urinary tract infections. And so they're now doing a phase 1B, in a patient population to set them up for proof of concept. And so I think we just have to watch some of these groups. And again, similar to the example about Entasis and bioMérieux, see what they do well, see what they don't, and see how we capitalize on them.
Thank you. So I realize that we're about at time. I think we could probably speak about many of these topics, for a couple more hours, but want to thank all the panelists as well as Dr. Farley for your participation today. Really, you've helped us understand some of the potential barriers, but also potential approaches, which is something we always are welcome. We know that there's this, especially when we talk about AMR, it's a challenging, complicated issue. And as Dr. Farley said, the work is never done. But I've been very impressed and thankful that you all have not only told us how complicated or complex and these issues may be, but you're also saying we have some paths forward. We need to be working on some harmonization efforts. We have much to learn from the studies that are ongoing, and that also can be applied for pediatrics. And I think that you're saying that it might not be an issue that we can fix tomorrow, but that we're making some incremental approaches. And so for that, I really think that you've given us a lot to think about at Duke Margolis for some policy options and ways to expand our work, and hopefully a dialogue that's been really helpful for our community as well. So I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Thank you to our panelists, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.